This clearly shows the truth of our Prophet ﷺ, because no one could ever have predicted this. The rise of a race that was considered to be a backward race. And this is the race of the Atrak, the Turks. Our Prophet ﷺ prophesied that this race would become dominant and that they would conquer the Arabs. Now, who are the Atrak? The Atrak are a group of races who originate in what is essentially Mongolia and the Caucasus Mountains, that region. Contrary to popular misunderstanding, the modern Atrak, the people of Turkey, are not from that land of Turkey. They are from far more east than that. They are from a land that is what is now, we call it Turkmenistan. And the Atrak came from there and they eventually conquered what is now modern Turkey. And it was called Turkey because the Atrak came there. Before they came there, it wasn't called Turkey. And the Arabs never interacted with them by and large. The Arabs hardly interacted with any race other than the Sassanids and the Byzantine Empire. For our Prophet ﷺ in Medina to predict that that far away race is going to rise up and eventually dominate, what is the Ottoman Empire other than Turkish, right? This is one of those miraculous predictions. And by the way, these ahadith were compiled centuries before the rise of the Ottoman Empire. You will find manuscripts written in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th century predicting the rise of the Atrak, and the Turks rose up 500 years ago, that's it. And there are many, many ahadith. The most famous amongst them, the Prophet ﷺ used alliteration. Alliteration means he said things that sound the same and they have a level of eloquence. Utrukul atraka ma tarakukum. Leave the Turks as long as they leave you. Because when you will fight them, you will lose. And they will win over you. And that is exactly what happened. So the rise of the Usman tribe, Usmanli, Ottoman is the children of Usman. And our Prophet ﷺ predicted that this empire and this group would become the dominant one. And that is exactly what happened, that when the Turks came, they eventually took over the Muslim land. And in the early part of the 16th century, 15 or so, they requested from the final remnants of the Abbasid Empire to hand over the Khilafah to them. And so they then acquired the Khilafah. And from around 1500 CE up until 1927, as you know, the Ottoman Empire was the Caliphate of Muslim lands. And it was the only empire that claimed to be the Khalifa that were non-Arab. Another prediction also related to the Ottoman Empire is just as bizarre. And that is the conquest of the single greatest city in the history of the medieval world. And that is Constantinople. Once again, what is Constantinople? Constantinople for 1,000 years was the bastion of Western civilization. Constantinople for over 1,000 years, it was the capital of the Roman Empire. Constantine himself, Constantinople is named after him. Constantine the Great established the capital. The city existed even before then. And for 1,300 years, it remained the capital of the greatest empire known to man up until that point in time. And that was the great Roman Empire. And Europe was nothing at the time. Europe was a backward land. Europe was barbarians at the time. Even Christianity has not spread in Europe when Constantinople was the center of Christendom and of the Holy Roman Empire. And the Prophet ﷺ predicted that the Muslims would one day conquer Constantinople. Again, an amazing prediction. How can a small group of persecuted people in Mecca daydream of conquering Constantinople? But our Prophet ﷺ predicted that. Now, because of this, the Sahaba had it in their minds that they wanted to conquer Constantinople. And in fact, the first Sahabi to launch a campaign to try to conquer Constantinople was none other than Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan. When he was barely in his early 20s, he managed to come very close to Constantinople via the navy fleet. As you know, they landed in Cyprus and then they landed on the banks of the Bosphorus, and then they attempted to conquer the city, but it was way too powerful. They laid siege, but they could not. It was simply too powerful for them. And that is why the famous companion Abu Ayyub al-Ansari, he died outside of the walls of Constantinople, and he was buried in an anonymous graveyard The point being that the Sahaba attempted to conquer Constantinople and their eyes were on the prize. Many people wanted to conquer Constantinople, but of course it only happened in the year 1453 by Sultan Mahmud al-Fatih. The Turks say al-Fatih Mahmud. And the conquest of Constantinople changed the course of human history. It marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. It's that big of a deal that the Muslims finally conquered Constantinople, and this was predicted by our Prophet ﷺ. Hadith is in Sahih Muslim that a Sahabi asked Abdullah ibn Amr ibn al-As that which one will we conquer first, Constantinople or Rome? They had heard of Rome. Rome was there, but Rome was not to the power and the level of Constantinople. It was far number 2. And so he said, bring me my book. So they opened up his book, because Abdullah ibn Amr ibn al-As, he would write a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. He looked it up and he wanted to refresh his memory, and he said, no, the Prophet ﷺ predicted that we would conquer Constantinople before Rome. And subhanAllah, Constantinople 1453. Now, there is a cryptic prediction about Constantinople that kind of sort of throws a spanner in the works. It kind of is difficult to understand. And I'll mention it to you, and let's see if we can get some understanding and leave the rest to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Some ahadith seem to mention that the Mahdi will conquer Jerusalem and also Constantinople. Okay, and that is somewhat problematic because Constantinople has already been conquered, the Mahdi wasn't there. And the explicit authentic hadith in Sahih Muslim tells us the mechanism via which Constantinople will be conquered. And that is that the Muslims will lay siege for a long time, and they will fall short of supplies, and the himma will be going down until finally they will say, let us do dhikr of Allah loudly, and we will conquer Constantinople via dhikr. And so they will begin chanting the tasbih and takbir and tahmeed, and eventually the walls of the city will begin to shake and the walls will collapse because of the dhikr of the Muslims. Now that did not happen in 1453. In another hadith we learn that Constantinople will be conquered by 70,000 children of Ishaq. The children of Isaac will help conquer Constantinople. How do we understand this? Allah knows best. But it appears this is talking about another conquest towards the end of times. It appears that a time will come where that land will no longer be considered a part of the lands of Islam. That's not the case right now. But something might happen that those lands are no longer considered the lands of Islam, and so once again there will have to be a reconquest. And so this hadith that talks about 70,000 of the children of Ishaq, who are the children of Ishaq? The Arabs would call the Romans children of Ishaq. And this hadith predicts that there will be many Western people, because Rome is the Western land, who will convert to Islam and who will be on the side of the Mahdi, and who will be fighting on the side of the truth, and they will then be reconquering Constantinople from whoever else it is. And at that point in time they will use the dhikr of Allah as a weapon. There will not be violence, there will not be bloodshed. They will simply say Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, and the dhikr will go louder and louder until, as a miracle from Allah, the walls of the city will collapse and they will simply walk in and conquer the city without any bloodshed. This is something that didn't happen in 1453. So clearly, therefore, there will be another conquering of Constantinople towards the end of times, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best.